A Walk in the Woods, by Bill Bryson. Introduction. Imagine this. You're 12 years old, tucked into a sleeping bag inside a small tent. You're on a camping trip in the deep woods of Quebec, miles from anywhere. It's the middle of the night, pitch black, and the only thing separating you from the vast, wild darkness is a thin layer of nylon. Suddenly, you hear a sound. A quiet grunt. A snuffing noise. Then, the clatter of a pot being knocked over. Your heart begins to pound. It's a bear. A 400-pound black bear, moving around your campsite. You hear the heavy pad of its feet, the brush of its thick fur against your tent. You hold your breath, praying it will just go away. And it does. But an hour later, it's back. And an hour after that, it's back again. 3 times, this massive, unseen creature circles your camp, driven by the lingering smell of dinner. Now, imagine what it was like for poor little David Anderson, age 12, when on the bear's 3rd visit, his tent was suddenly ripped open by a swipe of claws. Imagine the terror as the bear, maddened by the scent of food, bit into his small body and dragged him, screaming, out of the tent and into the dark woods. By the time his fellow campers could unzip their own sleeping bags and give chase, it was too late. Little David Anderson was gone. This is a true story. And it's the kind of story that author Bill Bryson was reading, night after night, just before he decided to go on a camping trip of his own. But not just any camping trip. He decided to walk the entire Appalachian Trail. Today, we're diving into Bill Bryson's masterpiece, A Walk in the Woods. This book is more than just a travel story. It's a profound, hilarious, and deeply human exploration of what happens when a man who is, by his own admission, profoundly out of shape decides to take on one of the greatest wilderness challenges on the planet. It's a story about friendship, about facing your own limits, and about rediscovering the wild, forgotten beauty of your own backyard. By the end of our journey today, you will understand not only what it takes to walk over 2,000 miles, but also why the attempt, even if you fail, might just be the most important part of any great adventure. So, let's begin. Book summary. Every great journey begins with a single step, but for Bill Bryson, it began with a path. After living abroad for nearly 20 years, he moved his family to a small town in New Hampshire. And there, on the edge of town, he found a trail that vanished into the woods. A small sign announced that this was the celebrated Appalachian Trail. Now, this isn't just any footpath. The Appalachian Trail, or the AT, is the granddaddy of all long-distance hikes. It runs for more than 2,100 miles along the spine of America's eastern mountains, from Georgia all the way to Maine. It crosses 14 states, climbing up and down peaks with names that sound like poetry: the Blue Ridge, the Smokies, the Green Mountains, the Whites. For Bryson, standing there, the idea was intoxicating. He could, in theory, just start walking from his new home and end up in Georgia, 1,800 miles away. Or he could turn the other way and hike to the fabled peak of Mount Katahdin in the deep wilderness of Maine. A little voice in his head whispered, "Sounds neat, let's do it." And so, he began to rationalize. It would get him fit after years of what he called waddlesome sloth. It would be a way to reacquaint himself with his native country. He'd learned to fend for himself in the wilderness, to no longer feel like a cupcake when other men told stories of the great outdoors. He wanted, as he so perfectly put it, the swagger that comes from being able to say, with a slow, manly sniff, "Yeah, I've shit in the woods." But there was a deeper, more urgent reason. The Appalachian forests, this ancient, magnificent sweep of hardwood trees, were in trouble. Scientists were predicting that climate change could devastate them, and trees were already dying in frightening numbers. If there was ever a time to see this singular wilderness, it was now. So he made his decision. He announced his intention to friends, to family, to his publisher. And then, he started doing his research. And that's when the trouble began. He quickly realized this wasn't going to be a gentle stroll. It was way beyond anything he had ever attempted. The woods, he discovered, were filled with peril. Not just rattlesnakes and bears, but things he couldn't even have imagined. He read about rabies-crazed skunks, merciless fire ants, and even moose driven mad by a parasitic worm that burrows into their brains and makes them chase hikers into glacial lakes. He heard stories, gruesome stories, of hikers who stepped out of their tents for a midnight pee only to be swooped upon by a short-sighted owl that tore off their scalp. He heard of a woman who woke to find a copperhead snake bunking down in her sleeping bag for warmth. And then there were the diseases. Lyme disease, which can erupt in a fiesta of maladies from facial paralysis to chronic depression. And hantavirus, a little-known organism that swarms in the feces of mice. You can inhale it by simply sleeping in a rodent-infested shelter, and all the shelters are rodent-infested. Hantavirus is almost as lethal as rabies or Ebola, and there is no treatment. But his greatest fear, the one that kept him staring at the ceiling night after night, was bears. He bought a book called Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance, and read clinically precise accounts of people being gnawed pulpy in their sleeping bags, plucked whimpering from trees, or stalked as they cooled their feet in a mountain stream. He became obsessed with the thought of lying alone in a small tent, listening to a bear just outside, wondering about its intentions. His particular dread was cemented by a photograph in the book showing 4 black bears prowling a campsite together. 4. He hadn't considered they might travel in parties. What would he do if 4 bears came into his camp? As he put it, he would die, of course. Literally shit myself lifeless. All this fear was compounded by another, more practical problem: the loneliness. What if he fell and broke his back? What if he got lost in a blizzard? You could die from a twisted ankle out there if you were alone. He needed a companion. He sent out feelers to friends, but no one responded. Then, just as departure was nearing, the phone rang. It was an old school friend named Stephen Katz. Katz was the last person Bryson expected to hear from. They had traveled through Europe together as young men, a trip that had started with them getting on each other's nerves and ended with them despising each other. Since then, their paths had diverged wildly. Katz had spent years in a haze of drugs and alcohol, a journey that included getting his car repossessed and a stint in a minimum security prison. But he had since gotten clean, attending AA meetings and trying to straighten out his life. "This Appalachian Trail deal," Katz said slowly over the phone. "Do you think maybe I could come with you?" Bryson was ecstatic. He wasn't going to have to walk alone. He didn't care about Katz's past or his current condition. He just needed a warm body to share the trail with. "How are you with bears?" Bryson asked as his last question. Katz replied, "Hey, they haven't got me yet." That was the spirit. A week later, Katz stepped off a small commuter plane in New Hampshire. And Bryson saw immediately that this was going to be interesting. Katz was, in his words, arrestingly larger than he remembered, bringing to mind Orson Welles after a very bad night. He was limping and out of breath after walking just 20 yards. His first words were, "Man, I'm hungry." He then explained that he needed to eat every hour or so, preferably donuts, or he might have seizures. When Bryson pointed out the lack of donut shops in the wilderness, Katz beamed. He had come prepared. He pointed to his massive army surplus duffel bag. It weighed at least 75 pounds. "Snickers," Katz explained. Lots and lots of Snickers. The preparation for the trip was a comedy of errors. The first stop was the outfitter store, where a kindly but overwhelmingly thorough salesman named Dave Mengel introduced Bryson to a world of high-tech gear he never knew existed. They discussed carbon fiber stays, side compression straps, and something called the occipital cutout ratio. Every piece of equipment, Bryson learned, was shockingly expensive and seemed to require another, equally expensive piece of equipment. A $250 backpack didn't come with straps and wasn't even waterproof. That required a separate rain cover. Then came the food shopping. Katz, taking charge, piled a cart high with pepperoni, Spam, pounds of rice, and the full range of Little Debbie snack cakes. They ended up with far too much, a problem that would solve itself in a rather dramatic fashion later on. Packing was a nightmare. Katz, overwhelmed, simply lay on his bed listening to his Walkman while his gear was scattered everywhere. The night before they left, noises floated through the walls, mutterings, enraged outbursts, and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. The next morning, they flew to Atlanta, where the man at the check-in desk gave them some cheerful news. "Lot of trouble with wolves down in Georgia, you know," he said, before adding that record colt was on its way. To Katz, he gave a final wink. "You watch out for those wolves, son, because between you and me you look like pretty good eating." Their journey began at Amicalola Falls State Park, the approach to Springer Mountain, the southern terminus of the trail. Every year, about 2,000 hikers set off from here, most intending to walk all the way to Maine. No more than 10% actually make it. A quarter don't even make it out of the first state. The next morning, March 9, 1996, under a clear blue sky but with a startlingly cold wind, they stepped onto the path. And the reality of their undertaking hit them like a physical blow. The first day was hell. Bryson was hopelessly out of shape, and his pack felt impossibly heavy. Every step was a struggle up an endless series of hills. The dispiriting thing about climbing a hill, he discovered, is that you can never see the top. Each time you think you've reached the crest, you find there is more hill beyond, and more beyond that, until it seems impossible any hill could be this long. Katz was falling behind almost immediately, panting, sweating, and talking to himself in a loud, bitter voice. Bryson pushed on alone, lost in his own world of weariness and woe. Late in the afternoon, he finally reached the summit of Springer Mountain. He waited for Katz. And waited. After 45 minutes, he went back to find him. He found Katz stumbling towards him, wild-haired and near hysteria. In a fit of rage at the trail's difficulty, he had thrown many items from his pack over a cliff. The pepperoni, the rice, the brown sugar, the Spam, all gone. He was, as Bryson put it, cataleptic with displeasure, feeling deeply betrayed by the trail. It wasn't what he had expected. That night at the first shelter, surrounded by other, lankier hikers, Katz simply crawled into his tent and went to sleep without dinner. In the morning, however, he was surprisingly apologetic. "Was I, would you say, a complete asshole last night?" he asked quietly. He was making coffee as a peace offering, filtered through toilet paper, because he had thrown the coffee filters over the cliff as well. It was then they took inventory of their remaining food. It was, Bryson notes, startlingly austere. Some noodles, raisins, coffee, salt, candy bars, and toilet paper. That was about it. Katz had flung the cheese. Bryson, for his part, had conveniently forgotten the oatmeal and all of the Little Debbie cakes back in New Hampshire. "You left the Little Debbies?" Katz asked, his face a mask of disbelief. "All of them?" His promised good mood was already being severely tested. And so they walked on, into the vast, featureless nowhere of the American woods. For Bryson, the woods were spooky. They make you feel small, confused, and vulnerable. You can't shake the feeling that you are being watched. Even famously tough men like Daniel Boone described parts of these mountains as so wild and horrid that it is impossible to behold them without terror. Their days fell into a simple routine. Rise at dawn, make coffee, eat a handful of raisins, and walk. They seldom walked together, as their paces didn't match, but Bryson would wait every few hours to make sure Katz was still coming. They were part of a loose affiliation of fellow hikers, all heading north, all sharing the same discomforts and the same eccentric impulse to walk to Maine. Then, on the fourth evening, they made a friend. Or rather, a friend made them. A plumpish young woman from Florida named Mary Ellen announced she would camp with them. Mary Ellen, as Katz would later call her in a special tone of awe, was a piece of work. She talked nonstop, had an opinion on everything, and was an expert on all of their mistakes. "Noodles?" she said, looking into their bowls. "Big mistake. Noodles have got like no energy." She criticized Bryson's tent, his boots, and their slow pace. "You guys must be like really out of shape," she declared, after they had hiked only 8 miles. "I did 14 too." When Bryson pointed out she had started from the same place as them, and that the distance was, in fact, only 8.4 miles, she just shook her head. 14 too. Her most memorable moment of unsolicited advice was directed at Katz. "You know what your problem is?" she said. "Pardon my French, but you're too fat. You should have lost weight before you came out here." Katz, to his immense credit, said nothing. They couldn't shake her. She was majestically inexperienced and clearly afraid to be on her own. So they became a trio, trudging up and over Blood Mountain, the highest peak in Georgia, their spirits lifted by one thought: Nails Gap. At Nails Gap was a place called the Wallacee Inn, a store where you could buy sandwiches and ice cream. After 5 days in the woods, arriving at a paved highway and walking through a door felt novel and exciting. The central feature of life on the trail, Bryson realized, is deprivation. It removes you so thoroughly from convenience that the most ordinary things, a can of pop, a slice of white bread, fill you with a sense of wonder that borders on the orgasmic. They bought egg salad sandwiches, took hot showers, and did laundry. For the first time, Bryson felt he really wanted to keep going. He was feeling fit, he was clean, and best of all, they had finally lost Mary Ellen. They hiked onto a perfect meadow for camping and celebrated with a surprise Bryson had bought: Hostess cupcakes. As they were lying there, content, Katz let out a low groan. Mary Ellen was striding down the trail toward them, from the wrong direction. "I wondered where you guys had got to," she scolded, before spotting the last cupcake. "Well, I don't mind if I do," she said, and ate it in 2 bites. It would be some days before Katz smiled again. They finally ditched her for good by hiking 14 miles in one day to Dix Creek Gap, where they hitched a ride into the town of Hiawassee. Their ride was a story in itself, a baby blue Pontiac Trans Am driven by a very happy, very drunk young couple who were getting married the next day. The driver, Darren, drove at terrifying speeds while his fiancée, Donna, celebrated by periodically lunging at him, causing the car to swerve excitingly into oncoming traffic. In Hiawassee, they ate a huge meal at the Georgia Mountain Restaurant, highlighted by a vast, canary yellow wedge of lemon pie for Bryson. But as he was about to dig in, Katz grew serious. He felt bad. They had ditched Mary Ellen, leaving her alone in the woods. As Bryson considered this, realizing with a horrible, seeping awareness that Katz was right, his appetite vanished. He pushed the pie away. Katz leaned closer and said, in a completely different tone of voice, "If you're not going to eat that pie, can I have it?" The next day on the trail, they met a hiker coming the other way who had stayed in a shelter with Mary Ellen the night before. "She a friend of yours?" he asked dubiously. They quickly denied it. The hiker then told them what she'd said about them. She'd called them a couple of overweight wimps who didn't know the first thing about hiking and said she was tired of carrying them. "In fact," he added, "actually I think she called you pussies." "She called us pussies?" Katz said, utterly scandalized. "Now I will kill her." Bryson's only response was to tell Katz, "Don't you ever, ever, spoil a piece of pie for me again." Their journey continued, but the pivotal moment, the one that would change everything, happened in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. After a miserable, rain-soaked, and crowded slog through the Great Smoky Mountains, they escaped to the town for a break. Gatlinburg is a tourist town, a shock to the system with its slurpy food, gift shops, and waddling crowds. In an outfitter's shop, Bryson spotted a map of the entire Appalachian Trail pinned to a wall. It was about 4 feet high. He looked closer, and his jaw dropped. Of the 4 feet of trail map before him, all their effort, all the miles, all the sweat and misery, added up to the bottom 2 inches. He went and got Katz. "We've done nothing," Katz breathed, his face drained of expression. It was obvious. They were never going to walk to Maine. And in a way, it was liberating. If they couldn't walk the whole trail, then they didn't have to. The mad, pointless business of stepping over every single inch of ground was gone. They could enjoy themselves. They decided right then and there to skip a huge chunk of the trail. They rented a car and drove 500 miles north to Virginia, to the Shenandoah National Park. Shenandoah was lovely. The terrain was gentler, spring was in the air, and wildlife was everywhere. Best of all, because the trail often parallels the scenic Skyline Drive, there were restaurants. It was against the purest spirit of the AT, but they happily stopped for cheeseburgers and Cokes. It was here, in Shenandoah, that Bryson had his own terrifying night with the bears. Or something. One night, a noise woke him from a deep sleep, the sound of breaking branches and a large, irritable snuffling. There, he sat bolt upright, heart pounding. He whispered to Katz, who was characteristically calm. "Everything sounds big in the woods," Katz mumbled. Bryson crept out of his tent and saw 2 shining eyes staring back at him from the darkness. When he asked Katz if he had anything sharp, Katz offered his nail clippers. Then, a second pair of eyes appeared. Just as his flashlight batteries died, Katz announced, "Well, I'm going to sleep," and promptly did. Bryson spent the night gripping a walking stick, ready for an attack that never came. He never knew what the creatures were, but he knew he would never again sleep in the woods with a light heart. After Shenandoah, their first leg of the journey came to an end. They had hiked 500 miles. They were, they declared, mountain men. They had shit in the woods and slept with bears. Katz went back to Des Moines, promising to return in August for the final, most difficult section, the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. Bryson tried hiking alone, but it wasn't the same. He felt a helpless and dispiriting pointlessness in it. He had lost his momentum, his connectedness to the trail. He missed Katz. But in August, as promised, Katz returned. They would tackle the infamous 100-mile wilderness, a 99.7-mile stretch of boreal forest with no stores, no houses, and no paved roads. It is the remotest section of the entire AT. If something goes wrong, you are on your own. Katz arrived with a brilliant, and terrible, idea. To save weight, he suggested they abandon their backpacks and instead use Des Moines Register newspaper delivery bags. "When was the last time you saw a paperboy with a hernia?" he asked, completely serious. Bryson talked him out of the bags, but they did agree to go light, leaving the stove and cookpots behind and subsisting on cold food like Slim Jims and Snickers. Maine was a shock. The state was in the middle of a killer heat wave, and the terrain was brutal. The trail in Maine, Bryson learned, has a hail devotion to seeking out the rockiest climbs and most forbidding slopes. It was the hardest hiking they had ever done. Worse, Katz was starting from scratch physically, and his first day back was a sweaty, painful ordeal. On the second day, They came to a murky lagoon that they had to ford. Both of them slipped on submerged logs and plunged into the chest-deep water, their packs dragging them down. Soaked and exhausted, they sat on the far bank when two young, fit hikers strode past. One of them looked at their sorry state and said, "This your first time hiking up here? Well, I don't want to discourage you, but mister, you've only just started to get wet." And then, in the town of Monson, on the eve of entering the 100-mile wilderness proper, came the next crisis. At dinner in their guest house, Katz seemed strangely hyper, almost manic. In the grocery store later, he begged Bryson to buy him a six-pack of beer. It turned out he had started drinking again back in Des Moines. Bryson, furious and feeling betrayed, refused. "Then fuck you," Katz said, and walked out. They entered the wilderness the next morning in a heavy, angry silence. The trail was hell. It was brutally hot, and the climbs were near perpendicular walls of rock. They quickly ran low on water. The day was a blur of exhausting effort and burning thirst. That night, camped by a stream, they were too tired to speak. The next morning, on the summit of Barren Mountain, Katz finally broke the silence. He apologized. "There's just this kind of hole in my life where drinking used to be," he explained, his voice quiet and humble. He talked about the loneliness of sobriety, of going home to a TV dinner while his coworkers went to a tavern. He didn't want to lecture, he just wanted his friend to understand. It was a moment of profound, painful honesty. The truce was made. But then, disaster. Bryson went ahead to a pond to filter water, telling Katz he would wait for him. But Katz never arrived. Bryson waited, then went back. He wasn't on the mountaintop where they had talked. He was gone. Bryson was consumed with worry. Katz was alone, with no map and no water, in the middle of the most remote wilderness on the trail. He might have fallen. He might have gotten thirsty and tried to find a lake cross-country, a fatal mistake in these vast woods. Bryson spent the night alone, sick with dread. The next morning, he pushed on, hoping to find him. 4 hours later, he found Katz sitting on a rock by the trail, scratched up and muddy, but alive. He had, in fact, gotten lost. Thirsty and confused, he had plunged into the woods trying to reach a lake he saw from the mountain. He quickly became totally lost. "It's weird," he said. "There's nothing to pay attention to out there. It's just one big woods." Just when he was about to give up and die, by a pure miracle, he stumbled back onto the AT. He was exhausted, scared, and out of his depth. "You want to go home?" Bryson asked him. "Yeah," Katz said. "I do." "Me too." And that was it. They hiked to a dirt logging road, hitched a ride in the back of a speeding pickup truck with some loggers, and just like that, their great adventure was over. They never saw Mount Katahdin. They ended up in a small town called Milo, at a cozy boarding house run by a kindly woman named Mrs. Bishop. As they walked through the quiet town that evening, Katz asked if Bryson felt bad about quitting. Bryson didn't know. His feelings were a mess of contradictions. He was weary of the trail but in its thrall, he wanted to quit and wanted to do it forever. Then Katz said something that put it all into perspective. "Anyway, we did it," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, I hiked the Appalachian Trail. I hiked it in snow and I hiked it in heat. I hiked it in the south and I hiked it in the north. I hiked it till my feet bled. I hiked the Appalachian Trail, Bryson." "We missed out a lot of it, you know," Bryson replied. "Details," Katz sniffed. And in that moment, Bryson realized he was right. They had tried. And that was enough. Bryson eventually calculated that he had walked 870 miles, not even half of the trail's total length. And yet, the number didn't matter. He had learned to sleep beneath the stars, he had become fit, he had gained a profound respect for nature, and he understood the colossal scale of the world in a way he never had before. He had made a friend. He had come home. They might not have walked all 2,200 miles, but they had tried. They hiked the Appalachian Trail. Commentary. So, what do we take away from a story like this? It's easy to look at Bill Bryson's journey and see it as a failure. He didn't reach his goal. He didn't walk every mile. He and Katz skipped a huge section in the middle and didn't even finish the final leg. By the strict definition of a through hike, they failed. But I think that's the most powerful lesson of this book. It redefines what it means to succeed. In a world that is so often obsessed with outcomes, with finishing the race, with getting the grade, with reaching the summit, Bryson's story reminds us that there is a different kind of victory. It's the victory of the attempt. It's the courage to start something you know is ridiculously hard, something you're not prepared for, and to see where it takes you. Think about it. Bryson wasn't an elite athlete. He was a middle-aged writer who liked comfortable chairs. And Katz, well, Katz was in a league of his own. They were magnificently, beautifully, humanly unprepared. And yet, they went. They faced the cold, the heat, the rain, the mud, the fears both real and imagined. They endured Mary Ellen. They carried heavy packs up impossible hills. They got lost. And in the end, they walked 870 miles. That's the distance from New York City to Chicago. That's not a failure. That's an achievement. This book is also a powerful meditation on friendship. The relationship between Bryson and Katz is one of the most honest and hilarious portrayals of male friendship I've ever read. They bicker, they complain, they drive each other crazy. Katz throws away crucial supplies. Bryson gets lost in his own thoughts. But when it matters, they are there for each other. When Katz is near collapse on that first day, Bryson goes back for him. When Katz is lost in the Maine wilderness, Bryson's only thought is finding him. And when Bryson is terrified of a bear in the dark, Katz is there. Well, he's there sleeping, but his presence is a comfort nonetheless. Theirs is a friendship forged not in grand gestures, but in shared misery and small, unspoken acts of loyalty. Finally, A Walk in the Woods is a love letter to a forgotten America. Through Bryson's eyes, we see the immense, silent, and deeply beautiful wilderness that still exists just beyond our highways. He reminds us that this beauty is fragile, threatened by pollution, neglect, and our own indifference. He shows us that you don't have to go to the Amazon or the Himalayas to find true wilderness. It's right here. The Appalachian Trail is a national treasure, maintained almost entirely by volunteers, a free and open path for anyone with the will to walk it. So what can you do with these lessons? First, find your own Appalachian Trail. It doesn't have to be a 2,000-mile hike. It can be anything that feels daunting, anything that sits just outside your comfort zone. The point isn't to conquer it. The point is to try. The point is to see how far you can go. Second, appreciate the small victories. Bryson's journey teaches us to find what he calls low-level ecstasy. The profound joy of a cold drink after a long, hot day. The relief of taking off a heavy pack. The simple comfort of a dry pair of socks. Our lives are filled with these small moments of grace, if only we take the time to notice them. And finally, go for a walk. You don't have to climb a mountain. Just find a local park, a trail, even a quiet street in your neighborhood. Leave the phone behind. Look up. Notice the trees, the sky, the way the light falls. Understand that you are a part of this vast, incredible world. As Bryson discovered, you don't have to walk hundreds of miles to feel the amazing complex delicacy of the woods. But believe him, it helps. That was the story of A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. We've journeyed through the highs and the lows today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only show you the map. The real territory, the real adventure, happens when you read the book for yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when Bryson's humor makes you laugh out loud or a description of a sunset takes your breath away. This summary is just a signpost, meant to help you decide if this is a path worth walking. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see yourself, your country, and the woods just beyond the edge of town. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing and walking together.